This is the April 30 edition of Breaking the Line, the ECNL podcast featuring ECNL President and CEO Christian Lavers and ECNL Vice President and Chief of Staff Doug Bracken. The ECNL podcast is all about you and for you, so if you have questions, please submit them to info@theecnl.com. With assistance from our podcast production lead, Jacob Bourne, and our producer, Colin Thrash, I'm Dean Linke. Today, Christian and Doug talk about coaching, specifically the reality of coaching youth soccer in America, the challenges, the rewards, the expectations, and knowing the most important job of coaching is to know what your job is. Of course, we can't end without a Bracken Brain Buster, and he keeps this week's question also focused on coaching. It's another great edition of Breaking the Line, the ECNL podcast, and it starts right now with Christian Lavers.
Thank you, Dean. Douglas?
Hello, Christian. That was quite an open.
Yeah,
today.
very short, to the point, brevity.
Yeah. Yes. How are you?
I'm good. It's getting towards the end of the season. I think everybody gets a little bit, there's a lot going on.
Yeah. A lot of events coming up for us. Playoffs, always fun. So
Just finished the Texas boys event which went well. And then I think between the May events we have out in the East Coast, and then 4 regional league playoffs, and then 2 ECNL playoffs, the next 8 weeks are the definition of insane, I think.
No question. We get through it thanks to our staff and all their efforts. So we'd be remiss if we didn't, give them a plug for all they do to make those things happen. So, I look forward to it.
Yeah. So what are we talking about today?
I think where we need to go, and I think this goes off of what kind of you touched on this in the last podcast, was just about the American coaching experience at the youth level. Obviously, the both of us have been at that for 25 plus years, seen it from club level, entry, starting out level, all the way up to being involved in this league, and so I think that also gives us an interesting perspective, maybe more global perspective on the youth game in this country. So I feel like I mean, if I asked, what would you say? I mean, if you had to define the American coaching experience in America, how would
the American
what would you
coaching
say?
experience in America?
In America?
So you know what I would say, what this popped up, the first thing is we always use this term, he's a soccer guy, right? And what does that mean? And because there's people who love soccer, who work in soccer, that are not sort of don't meet the definition of what is referred to as soccer guy, right? And I think my take on that is a soccer guy is somebody who has coached a team, multiple teams, probably been in some leadership role in a club where they have had to deal with some of the friction and conflict in the youth sporting experience. And so what do those two experiences together, coaching and then being in some leadership role, mean? It means they've had to release a player or cut a player. They've had to make really hard decisions on playing time, of like, do I make this change when it's not going to help me win, or do I not make the change and hope that the team wins? And maybe sometimes the team winning is really helpful for the environment and for some of the pressures or stresses that people are feeling. And obviously take away any age issues on this, just assume we're talking about older on that. Has been yelled at, has been criticized, has been responsible for the wins and losses, and has some great experiences with parents and players, has some not great experiences. That to me is the stereotypical soccer guy. What do you say to that?
I say, are you a soccer guy?
I hope. I think.
You
I
think?
mean, I certainly have. I have the wounds to show that.
The way you said it kind of carried a little bit of a negative connotation.
No. Actually, I hope not. I think the way I described it in terms of some of the wounds, yeah, I think there is some, there's some callousing that happens. But what I mean by that is when we normally say, "Hey, he's a soccer guy," I think we use that as a positive and saying, "Hey, he understands. He or she understands. They've been in the trenches. They've been in the position. They've gone through tryouts and dealt with the kid who says yes, the kid that says no, that says yes, then no, the kid that waits for five offers to make one, all that sort of stuff." To me, when we say, "Hey, man, that person's a soccer guy or soccer girl," we're talking about somebody who's not just they don't just like soccer. They didn't just play soccer. They're not just in a sports business. There's somebody who's been in the trenches in the youth game and have all the lessons and learnings that come from that. And I think we talk about that a lot because those people are the essence of our league. They're the people on our board. They're the people that, we talk to the most about what does the game need and what should we do. And they're the people I think most in touch with what is happening in American youth soccer. They're fully vested in it.
And how do you become a soccer guy or girl? Whenever we say guy, we also mean girl.
There we go.
Yeah.
I think most people have the same starting point, which is they finish playing at some point.
It's hard.
A
Finishing
lot,
playing is hard.
yeah. A
Yep.
lot of them it's post college. Some people it's prior to that because they don't play in college. Some people it's after that because they play beyond college. But I think the most common entry point to becoming the soccer guy, soccer girl, and then getting into the trenches is you finish playing, you love the sport, you want to stay involved, maybe you want to make a living in it. It's not, I don't think that's always necessarily the case, but you definitely want to stay in it. And you say, well, I'm just going to the sidelines. I'm the coach, and you take a team, and
How
then a
in,
long twisted path begins.
yes, we're going to talk about every part of that. How important is it to have played?
It's important, I think, to. I don't think you need to have been I don't think you need to have been an excellent player or a great player. And I do think that there are people that haven't played that have done a great job coaching. I mean, you can look and say Bruce Arena played lacrosse, right? And he did a heck of a job with the men's national team for a long time. I think having played helps you understand some things. But I had a conversation the other day where somebody was saying when you're dealing with 5, 6, 7 year olds, that you might want a parent, who knows how to deal with kids, who can be
Yeah.
as effective or more effective in coaching sometimes than, your former pro who can juggle 7,000 times and bend a ball into the corner of the goal in dealing with 6 and 7 year olds. So I think it depends. But I think having the background of a player gives you at least some, in theory, understanding of the sport that doesn't come from reading a book, watching it on TV or whatever. It gives you a feel for some things. But do I think you have to be a great player? No. And then I think there's also, there's anecdotal stories anyway about being a really, really good player sometimes can make it harder in coaching, especially when coaching, youth players that you have to teach something to.
How often have you? I feel like I'm asking a lot of questions. I have some opinions that I will share.
Yeah, you're asking a lot of good questions.
Yeah,
I'm not
thank
asking
you.
any good questions right now.
How often have you, in your coaching experience, harkened back to when you were a player? Like how often do you go and say, do you like take a step back and say, let me look at this through the lens of the player that I'm giving this information to or having this conflict with or trying to coach or whatever?
I think you hit on two different things there because I think trying to put yourself in the place of the player and having that empathy, or understanding is something we all in coaching probably need to be doing on a regular basis. And if we're all honest, we probably should be doing it more than we are. So I think that that's different than hearkening back or thinking back to your playing. And if I go back, we go back to that entry point of the soccer guy or soccer girl. When you first start coaching, and maybe tying into your second question, your playing background is the only thing that you feel like qualifies you to coach. And so it probably is in your mind a lot. I remember the first training sessions I ever probably did. I probably just did what I did as a player because I didn't know any differently. I tried to adapt it to whoever the level was.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but I think the longer you coach, if you're still referring to your playing background in year 20 of your coaching career, I think you probably have a problem in your coaching career.
Yeah, I think I go back to, and of course, the farther you get away from your playing career, the less those experience necessarily can influence you because you have more coaching experience that you can lean on or whatever. But I always I remembered pretty distinctly as a player in different sports thinking about, and particularly as I got older as a player, like thinking about how I would deal with, or whatever it is, how I would teach this particular thing, or how I would deal with this situation or whatever. So I feel like um, maybe you're already kind of formulating those things, not just necessarily like leaning on what your coaches did with you, although that's a big part of it, but also thinking in those moments like, okay, like how would I? And I think that's how you get kind of drawn to coaching, is if that's how you think. Like, oh, I now am thinking while I'm experiencing this as a player, how I would deal with it as a coach, or what I would do to teach this, or what path I would take these players on.
Well, that's probably the hardest thing in the transition from player to coach is going from having a direct impact on the game because you're a player, you get to do everything, right? And if
Yeah.
you want, and as a coach, all you really can do is put people on the field and hopefully they listen to you or hopefully you can impact their thinking. But to me, that was one of the hardest transitions is understanding that, okay, well, this isn't, and I'm not pretending like I was a great player because I wasn't. But going from, okay, you get to play, you get to go out there and execute things and directly impact the game versus now it's being a step removed from that, and understanding to your point of this is now not just my opinion. I have to influence the minds of 18 other people to try and make it their opinion or their perspective or their perception.
What was your first kind of experience coaching wise, age, all that kind of stuff?
First camps. I mean, I think we all did college soccer camps in the summer.
Yeah.
Um,
I did Soccer Plus goalkeeper school.
a
Went
lot of
around.
people, a lot of people did that.
That's right.
That was like a bonding thing
Shut
for all those
yeah.
people that did that.
Shout out to Tony DeChico. You would be surprised how many people out there in coaching were in those.
Oh no, I'm not anymore, man, because I was surprised, and then you
Wow.
just kept running. Every single goalkeeper coach in the country, where it was at Soccer Plus
100%.
at some point, I think.
100%. 100%. And a lot of them, have really leaned into that part of the game. A lot of friends and people I worked with, but also a lot of us have taken that and gone and coached teams and gone that route. So yeah, crazy legacy. Talk about legacy. I mean,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
big one.
Well, so
So
so let's go. I'll take your question and go a little more general, is because we're talking about the American coaching experience. That I think when we touched on this last week, and we were talking with Chris Leahy about how all of us are, you, me, Chris, a lot of others, Jason Cutney in our league, are coaching less than we used to.
yeah,
And that, there was a time I remember having conversations with a lot of people, you included, when nobody could ever imagine the day they weren't coaching on the sidelines 7 days a week, whatever it may be. And as you get older in this, there become more and more people that do step off the sidelines more. And we sort of ask the question of, why is that? And is that a good thing? Is it an inevitable thing? It doesn't seem to be the type of thing that you don't hear. I think, as we said, you don't hear kindergarten teachers saying, "I can't wait to get out of the classroom."
yeah.
But you do hear soccer coaches say, "Hey, I don't want to be on the field as much." And maybe there are teachers that you get to the point where they want to be less in the classroom. I don't
Yeah.
know.
I think to do anything really well, and I can only relate it to coaching, you put really a lot into it. And it takes a lot of energy. And we'll touch on this, but when you're coaching more than likely multiple teams, and there were times when I was coaching 3 teams, 4 teams at one time, which is silly, but it's a
At
fact,
least at one point,
right?
you might have been doing more than that. Yeah.
Just because you're trying to get in it, which I will, we'll talk about. That requires a lot of energy, and um, it's so different, like because every group is different. They have different personalities and different things that every group takes this unique energy that you need to give, and that you know doesn't even talk about the things that you think about of how you need to teach them and what you need to teach them, where they are in their process and how you need to keep them going. But I think that's the biggest thing, for me, it's that level of energy that you have to give, and and being able to do that effectively over a long period of time with multiple different groups when it comes to youth coaching most of the time, although it's changed a little bit.
Well, let's pause there, because if you can talk about energy is directly correlated then, how much you have to give based on how many teams you have. So if you start with the typical, again, you finish playing, you start to coach. I think probably when we started there weren't very many full-time positions in coaching. Now there are, so this changes a little bit, but generally you start with a team or a couple of teams, probably lower level, younger ages. Whether that's the right place to put a new, inexperienced coach is a different question. But so you start with a couple of teams, and when you say lower level, younger ages, I think what that also generally means is to some degree a little bit less pressure. If I'm going to be in terms of results or the
Mm.
college recruitment path, very few people start coaching in an ECNL team, for example.
I mean, I never felt any pressure different from one to the other. Like every team has its own pressures,
Well,
whatever they
that's
are.
fair. That's fair. I guess what I'm trying to say is if you take a step back and you're looking at your club and you're saying where is the most pressure on, it's going to be more on the U16 or 17 ECNL coach than the under 8, or
I
under
don't,
11 coach.
yeah, I agree with you 100%, although I don't necessarily think that's right.
Right. I mean, there's
Right.
that old thought experiment that says if we really want to make soccer better, we should put the best coaches with the youngest kids, right? And
Hard, hard
that's
to
hard
do.
because
Hard
you
to
can't.
do.
Yeah, you can't. That's a different
I mean,
skill
there's
set.
that. And I think it's important to talk about this real quick, is because this has such an important impact on the whole experience. Is as a club person and a club leader, you have these pressures of doing well, helping kids get to college, and I'm assuming we're all competitive people, but and so there is that internal kind of pressure of where do you deploy your best people, um, and that is a really hard thing, because a lot of us would probably say, to our point, we would put those more experienced people with younger kids to help them develop, because once a kid is 16, a lot of what they are is what they are. um, but that is a huge internal pressure within a club of, if Christian Lavers is my best guy, where do I put him? He could maybe be most effective with our youngest kids, but the reality is I need to probably put him with our oldest, highest level teams,
Well,
because
so that's another issue, right? So we're dancing around a couple things. So number one is let's take the typical career path, and then the number two is what you talked about, which is then coaching at different ages and stages, and what coaches want, what clubs want, what might be right or not, or the opinions on that. But the first part on the career path, it's to start with a couple of teams. Generally, again, we're speaking in generality here. You're not coaching the top teams. You're not coaching the oldest players when you start as a young coach. You're starting in younger ages. then if you do well, if you have some success, however you're going to define that, and you enjoy it, you're going to get more teams. You're going to get older teams. You're going to get better teams. At some point, you get a lot of teams, and you become a director. And then, and by the way, that's the only way really that you make a career path in terms of compensation, right? And then as a director, you now are in theory responsible for overseeing coaches, directing them, and programs. And those programs can be, you can be, clubs can divide programs by leagues. So you're the ECNL director, the RL director. They can be by age group. Some clubs do it by, U12 to U14. They chunk together U12 and down. You can do it in a variety of different ways, but you become a director, which means you're responsible for overseeing and coaching coaches in theory, but it's not really that way because to be a director, it means generally you're still coaching a couple of teams, maybe more than a couple, and you have oversight of the program, but it doesn't leave you a lot of time to actually direct the coaches. And that is an economic issue because most clubs cannot afford to pay somebody not to coach players directly. They don't have the resources to say, hey, this person is going to just watch the coaches and coach the coaches and not be assigned specifically to a team. So there's a little weirdness in that coaching path, and then whether you go from director of a program to director of a gender to director of a club to technical director versus something else, you can go in a variety of different ways. But would we agree that's generally the coaching
Yeah.
path?
Yeah. I'd say so.
And then so you have one question, which is how many coaching directors are actually able to direct coaches versus they've got their hands full coaching the teams that they're assigned. So anything they do with respect to trying to direct coaches or educate or mentor coaches is a smaller piece of the calendar or their day than probably some would like or that they can even do. And again, that's not their fault. That's an economic issue. And then the other issue is, to go back to the topic we teased earlier, when you go into teaching, because everybody analogizes coaching, teaching, coaching, teaches, and there's a lot of similarities for sure. But I don't believe it's the case that when people go in and they're going to be a fourth grade history teacher or math teacher, they don't have ambitions of being a college professor, and it is true that for a lot of people, if they start coaching the young kids, they want to end up coaching the older kids, and that is not right or wrong. But what it sort of fails to state is that it's a very different skill set in coaching younger players and coaching older players, and it's not a sign of upward progression in your coaching ability necessarily just because you're coaching older players. There's a lot of people who move in that direction as coaches because that's what they want. But I think we would all agree that it is a very unique skill set to coach and teach young players very early on in their learning. It's actually where you can probably make the most impact. It may actually be the hardest thing to coach is the younger players compared to the older players. What do you
Oh,
say to
yeah.
any of that?
I mean, one of the first teams and I went into the college game first, and then I came into the youth game. One of the first teams I had was a 9-year-old team, and I left there after the first couple of weeks, and I was like, I can't do anything. I can't get these kids to do anything. I'm terrible, right? And so it is really unique skill set, and I think it's a huge challenge at the club level to create a culture or an environment where people want to specialize in that way because there is this perception, and I don't, rightly or wrongly, that is a lower level. And that's a real challenge. I mean, we have it here. We're like, I'm just talking to our coaches all the time about how they want to move up and coach older teams and do this. And it's like, so it's a real challenge.
Well,
And I
and go ahead.
and I agree with you that it takes some really special personality and a certain kind of demeanor and whatever to coach younger kids. And I also agree that you can have a huge impact on them by getting a good coach with them early in their development process. So, but it is a challenge from a coaching perspective to get people to get coaches to buy into that.
Well, and right now, I mean, I've said this before, I'm coaching my son U8. And to your point of what you're able to do, I mean, it can be an incredibly humbling experience because you say to somebody, go play right midfield. And you know what the next question is?
What's right midfield?
Which side is right? And you're like, oh my gosh, they don't know right from left. And they can't tie their own shoes, most of them. And so that's the reality of their kids. That's where they're at. And knowing how to gain some control of that environment, keep it fun, teach anything, is just a totally different challenge than saying, okay, I've got a 17 team. I know who I'm playing. We have video and some scouting report. We're going to be overmatched, and we got to figure out how we're going to defend and counter in this game and how we're going to exploit some weaknesses that the other team might have or protect some things. It's just a totally different skill set. I
Totally.
mean, you can say the job's beyond the fact that it's got a ball and grass and some uniforms. It's a totally different.
Here's another huge challenge in that goes to the experience. What we're talking about is, generally speaking, in my experience, the parents who are an important part of the process, no matter how you slice it, we've talked about that on this podcast before, are less educated at the younger ages. And so can be a much more challenging management of that part of it. A lot of times as the kids get older, the parents seem to start to understand a little bit more about what's going on and be a little bit more educated about it. That doesn't mean that the whole college recruitment thing doesn't make people crazy, because it does. But so that's another challenge. You're putting potentially an inexperienced coach who's trying to figure out how to get their 9-year-olds to understand what right midfield is and how to package that so they can take it and use it. But in the meantime, you're also dealing with the realities of uneducated parents who are want to be supportive, and you need their support, but they just don't know some stuff. So I think it's a kind of a double-edged sword for coaches of younger teams to deal with that. And that, it also could tie back to why people get off the field. I mean, at some point you do get a little bit exhausted with
Well, so if you tie those together, right? So we've said that the coaching career path generally is you go from coaching teams to directing, which means you just have a lot more teams to coach and you have coaches to coach. And
I mean, I would say there are very few clubs where the coaching of coaches is happening
on a regular basis.
Correct.
Yeah, there's some informal conversations, there's some meetings periodically, but there's very, very, very few. You could probably count them on one hand that have a position, a full-time position, who is not coaching any teams, but is responsible not for admin, not for facilities, but is responsible for coach development and coach education. And before everybody says, "Oh my gosh, that's so terrible," that's because there's not enough money to do that.
Right. And also, you have people who are coaching for you. The greater majority of them are part-time, and so getting them education or getting them information is really challenging.
Well, and then we also have, you have this in, the famous management principle, the Peter principle, that, the best salesperson doesn't necessarily make a good sales manager. And so being a really good soccer coach doesn't necessarily make you a very good soccer director. If the job of director is to coach coaches, now we've established that that doesn't happen very often. What the director's doing is coaching more teams and having more stuff on his plate. And you could make some argument that in some way that takes one of your best coaches, that's why they kind of rose up to become director, is now stretched so thin that are they able to do as well as they would have been before they were a director because now they've added other stuff onto their plate. So it's a very complicated progression,
Yeah.
and it's and I guess to your point, you know, if you look and say, okay, there's people that eventually are saying, hey, I want to be on the field less, and part of that is an energy level. You know, we've talked before. One of the biggest problems we have in the country is at some point, then when you say, I don't have the energy for this, or I've been doing this for 30 years and I'm exhausted and I don't want to do it anymore. I want a different challenge. There is not that career path in very many places to use all of the knowledge and experience that that person has gained, usually by trial and error. Because again, we go back, there's not a lot of informal and consistent mentoring or coach education within the daily club environment. There's not a career path that allows that person then to be in a position to help the next generation of coaches avoid some of the same pitfalls, and maybe to learn things a little bit faster and earlier than they did.
And you face the reality of, does the next generation want to hear it from you? I mean, that's real, you know. And simply being the boss isn't, you know, it probably isn't enough to get you there. So, you know, I always think a third of the people that are working in your club as part-time coaches are really passionate about what they're doing, and the middle third of are good, solid people you could count on and have them there, and they'll do a good job. And then you have a third of the people who just aren't really interested in what's going on collectively. So there's some real challenges there with just getting people that information. So,
Well,
but
then let's turn it to another issue of measuring. We talk about, hey, you're a good coach, you're a successful coach. What does that mean? Because, you know, it's the good coaches, quote unquote, or the successful coaches that, you know, go beyond enjoying what they're doing, presumably, that go from coaching a couple teams to more teams to a director to a whatever. So then you start to say, well, what does it mean to be successful? And how do you measure that? And that's another thing. And I think we were talking about this the other day. There's this sense, and I think it's throughout all of American sports, that the coach is this got this magical power to transform athletes from complete, you know, donkeys to thoroughbreds. And it's not the player, it's just the coach. And I remember hearing this from a lot of people, and I think you had a what was a
yeah,
statement you made?
the quote was by the great Italian coach Trapattoni, who said, "A great coach can make a team 10% better, but a bad coach can make a team 30% worse," which I think is really interesting. That
And I actually I think we both agree generally with that.
Yeah,
Coaches get
100%.
way too much credit when things are going well. They get way too much blame when they don't. But just to take that, because I think it can be a little nebulous, but say let's just take that statistic and make it real. And a great coach can take a 9-1 team to 10-0, you know, and maybe be
Yep.
the difference in that game against the rival, whatever it may be. And it can take a bad coach can take that same 9-1 team, and all of a sudden they're 6-4. But the reality is those players were going to win 6 to 9 games regardless of who was coaching. 6 to 10 games regardless of who was coaching. The 9-1 team wasn't going to go to 1-9 because of the coach, and the 0-10 team isn't going to 8-2. because of the coach.
Yeah, I
It's
mean it goes back to that. Also, we talked about this a long time ago about there was this book. It's called Why We Win. Billy Packer wrote it, and they asked all great coaches, not just in soccer, but obviously in all sports, what is the key ingredient to winning? And by and large, all all of the coaches said talent. Like having talented players is the number one consideration uh, for winning. Now, all this kind of works in this pyramid idea, right? Where the kind of the cream rises to the top, and then at some point you're going to get challenged against people who are as talented as you. You're going to go up against a coach who's as good as you, and then some of these other little variables start to take effect, right? But I think it's so right. I mean, I know you've had it. I've had it where I've coached multiple teams, and one team did really great and one team didn't do that great. And it wasn't like we were doing a lot of different stuff with the two groups, right? It's the same stuff. It's different players. And that's a fact. And that's not to also to absolve myself from any responsibility for making bad decisions at times or whatever, because I probably did. But the reality is, to your point, the team that's 9-1 is probably not going to be 1-9.
well, and to that, because somebody can say, well, why are we talking about this? It's cliched, or it's this is the trite debate that always happens. Well, it's because at the youth level, if you take the assumption or the premise that the quality of the player is going to be the primary driver of competitive success or failure. And then you go into youth soccer, where you are very much limited in most places in terms of your selection of players. Well, then there is a large degree of your competitive success that is going to be defined by the size of the market you are in, especially when we go into these bigger, the consolidation that has happened, across ECNL and what's happened with the talent of the player pool within ECNL or even in some of these other platforms. At the end of the day, the bigger market, by definition, is going to outperform the smaller market if the driving variable is the quality of the player. And if we are seeing a consolidation of the levels of player, the top players are coming together more frequently than they were.
Yeah, 100%. Yes, facts. I don't know. I mean, I don't know how you measure it. How I measure it is, and I go back to my daughter's high school team. And there are a lot of great high school coaches out there. They don't get paid a lot of money. So there's also some really not great high school coaches out there. And the environment can be wildly, the distance between the best player and the worst player is huge. And that's, could be problematic. And we could talk about high school soccer. It serves a good purpose. And I have a lot of respect for the coaches and what they do. What I looked at was I watched him, and his teams always got better as the season went on. And that was essentially how I judged it. I looked and I said, at the beginning of the season, if they were a train wreck because they had no idea, they weren't organized, they don't know what they're doing. And then over the course of the season, you always had this feeling like they're going to do as well as they can. And I don't know what that means from year to year. It might mean you make it to districts, or I don't even know what these things are called. And so when I look at coaches, or I'm judging a coach, because to your point, it could be nebulous and hard, and all that. Do the players get better?
And that requires a longitudinal analysis, or at least it's an eye test over time of saying, are they capable of doing more things than they were at the beginning of the year? And by the way, they still might be 1-9, but it is a better 1-9.
Correct.
And so that adds additional stresses and challenges in coaching
Yeah.
because you
Yes.
don't get immediate, people don't immediately look and say, I mean, what the easiest and most common refrain is to say, well, who are the best coaches? Well, who's won the most, and which teams or which clubs are at the top. And again, to be very clear, there are very good coaches that are working with some of the best teams in our leagues. All right, this is not saying different, but what we are saying is you can take a coach who just won a national championship with one group of players, and they can go 0-20 with a different group of players and still do a phenomenal job of helping those players get better, but they're still going to be 0-20.
Yeah. Yeah. And so again, that's to that point is let's take the level of the team out of it and try to look at do this where they started at point A, whatever point A is, and they are at point B, and they're better. The kids are better, the players are better, whatever. So I think, yeah, winning can be a very not necessarily. I mean, it could be a little bit of a false indication of great coaching. Um, although if you win, you've probably done something right. But yeah,
Yeah. Well, so I mean, this all was under the auspices of this conversation is, hey, what is the coaching career path here? And I think our short answer is it's convoluted, it's very difficult. We haven't even talked about what are the sort of logistical realities of being a youth soccer coach,
we should, and we
which
should. I think we should talk about the challenges that are real. We need to hear a word from our sponsors, Christian, um, and I am the designated reader. So the ECNL is pleased to announce Quick Goal as the official goal provider and partner for ECNL girls and ECNL boys, a new partnership created to support the growth and development of the country's top players, clubs, and coaches. At all national events, including national playoffs and national finals, the Quick Goal Coaches Corner will provide hospitality and special space for ECNL girls, ECNL boys, and collegiate coaches. Quick Goal will also be the presenting sponsor of the National Championship winning ECNL Girls and ECNL Boys Coaches of the Year and the ECNL Girls and ECNL Boys Goals of the Year. Quick Goal looks forward to helping ECNL continue to elevate the standards of youth soccer and provide more opportunities to players on and off the field in the coming years. There you go. Thank you, Quick Goal.
very good product.
Very nice product.
Got a couple of folding mini goals in my backyard.
Do you?
Oh yeah.
Nice.
Yeah, so let's talk about the logistics because in all of this, again, and we go back to the fundamental question, it's like why do so many coaches burn out? I guess is the most blunt way of saying it. Why do they burn out after a period of time? Why do you see such turnover? And my phrase or the statement I think you've heard me say before is that the coaching career path generally for a lot of people ends up selling real estate at age 60. Because they just burn out. And so why is that? And we talked about all these different things. And I guess if I summed it up, it would say there is a convoluted career path. There is a path for more financial reward, but nobody's really getting rich. And I know somebody's going to say something different, and I'm going to say no. That's just not how it goes for 99% of people. So there is a path where you can have a little bit more authority, you can have a little bit more compensation and all that sort of stuff. But it is convoluted because you're not moving up in management per se. Because while you're still now a director, you're still actually on the ground floor coaching players a lot of the time, the vast majority of your time. And then there is some confusion or difficulty or inability for most people to measure your performance because the easy metric of wins and losses, if every coach in every sport is saying the quality of players the driving factor, then I think we should probably listen to that. So that makes it a gray area for that. And now we're going to talk about the logistics. And that is that if I'm a youth soccer coach, the only times I can train players for most of the year anyway, is somewhere between 4 and 9:30 at night. And it's hard to start at 4 because they got to get off of school. And you can't go much after 9:30 because it starts to get difficult. So whatever you're doing and however many teams you're managing, and most teams are training 3 days a week, some four, some two, but let's just say most are three. But you're going to be on the field nights and weekends for the majority of the year because you're coaching, your older teams they're going longer and longer. Their seasons are longer. Some are playing year round, not playing high school soccer. Even when some kids go to high school soccer, you probably have a group that isn't. You're still probably doing a younger team as well. So your nights and weekends, which means you get home if you coach, and you've done this, right? You coach a session that goes from 8 to 9:30. By the time you shut the field down, turn off the lights, pack up and get home, you're not out of the park till 10. You're probably not home till 10:30, 10:45 at night. Then you got to wind down from sort of the energy, excitement, stress, whatever from being on the field. So you're probably not in bed till close to midnight. And then you get up, you're going to do the same thing the next day, but it's nights and weekends, the same time when most of the people of your peer group or your age, they work during the day, they're home nights and weekends. You're in the exact opposite schedule. So it's not as bad as the third shift at a factory, but you are in an off schedule, which is hard for your personal relationships. It's hard for family relationships. It's hard for kid relationships. I mean, you want to comment on any of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you've touched on one factor, and when you use the word burnout, I would say it's the same reasons why everybody burns out at what they do. Players burn out. That's a big, hot topic out there, right? Is player burnout. And why do players burn out? These reasons are all the same as why coaches burn out, right? And yes, there is a real toll to that as it relates to personal toll, because you're there nights and weekends, and it's a lot, and you're just away. If you have a family, it's hard. There's no other way to say it. So, but I just think,
Well, and let's just be honest. There's a lot of single or divorced coaches because of that.
sure there are. Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's just a challenge. That part of it is challenging. Now, there are other industries that work different hours and different stuff like that. So, but I think if you put that with some of the other factors of, it's you have that there are some expectations that can be really unrealistic. I think we had some numbers here about, how parents believe, 83% of parents think their children can play college sports. 49 believe they should receive an athletic scholarship. The reality is 6% of high school athletes play in college and 2% receive scholarships. Right now in the ECNL,
I mean, where do people come up with? I mean, can you
different.
quote that? Where that study's coming from? Do you know? Or maybe Jacob could tell us.
I think it was not a soccer related. It was all sports. Um, and one of the other ones is 75% of parents think that their children could possibly play professional sports. And the reality is only 1% of players play professionally. And so there is that over involvement, that helicopter, that conflict that is ever present. That makes it harder to coach the players, because the players are hearing something from home that is counter to what you're trying to do. And so that makes your ability to affect the environment harder. And then you giving up the weekends and the nights on top of that. And it's what happens. That's what causes burnout. I mean, it is.
It strikes me, and I think we got a comment here. From the New York Life Insurance Wealth Watch stats. So I'm not sure where that comes from, but Jacob pulled that. So That's where those numbers come from. It does hit me for a second here, though, that we're painting a bleak picture. And if it was so bleak, I, Chris, everybody we've talked to wouldn't do it. It is, I look and say I've had some unbelievable experiences as a coach. It can be a tremendously rewarding thing. And when people go into it, they tend to throw everything about them into it, and it tends to take a huge amount of their time by choice because they're
Yeah.
excited about it
Yeah.
and
It's
they love the
passion.
travel and it's
Yeah.
a passion job. And I think what we're highlighting in this is that coaching is really, it can be really, really fun, but it is really, really high time demand, really high energy demand, and there's a lot of other factors around it. And I do think it would be, I'll just speak my own opinion. I do believe there is a coaching path problem in this country, in terms of a career path. And we've loved coaching. We continue to coaching. There's going to be a lot of great people, and we're not saying, "Oh, feel sorry for all these coaches," because we are those coaches. We're saying, "Hey, I think we need to look and say, how do we make this more sustainable for longer? How do we find ways to take advantage of the experience level of coaches that have done it for 30 and 40 years, so that the next generation, to your point, Doug, they want to learn from those people. They're in a position where they're accountable for learning from those people, where those people do have the ability to recognize their changing career and changing tasks. And I think that is a question for the future of soccer in this country, because I would like to think also that if we had a better coaching career path that kept more coaches in the game longer to give back to the next generation of coaches, we would see the game continue to improve faster, because you'd be learning from things in a way that I think there's a lot of people making the same mistakes in coaching now that probably you and I made 20 years ago, that the people before us made 20 years before that,
Oh
because
yeah.
nobody was there to say, hey, don't do that. Here's a better way.
Yeah. Yeah. Just listen, don't get me wrong. Like you and I mean, sat next to each other, many, many years ago, uh, when, we were fairly early in our coaching. I mean, I think either one of us, if you said to me when I was 20, hey, you're going to coach and you're going to be able to make a living at it and, do all the things that we've had the opportunity to do, I'd immediately sign up for it. It is a passion. It's something that you feel very drawn to, and it's why you you want to do it. And to your point, I've had some unbelievable experiences, unbelievable just to see some players and where they go and what they're able to accomplish, and that you have a small part in that is makes everything well worth it. But there are
Yeah.
definitely challenges in
Well, and
it.
this is just the youth perspective, right? Because,
Right.
and we've talked about how it's so different, to be a coach of under 10s versus under 18s. That's all in the youth space, right? But it's a completely different job. And we also probably need to have better career paths for the guy who or girl who's going to be the expert in working with players age 8 to 12,
Yeah.
because and that's again a different set of skills, and it should be a different slight career path than the person who's going to become an expert working with players in that 15 to 18 age group that, now I guess falls into this pre-pro sort of, whether they go to college or beyond. That's a very, very different job. College is a very different job. They also have very different logistical demands. I mean, I always say, if somebody says, what's the biggest difference between college soccer and youth soccer? Well, some of the big ones are you coach one team or you coach five teams or four teams or whatever it is.
And
You
if you're an
have
assistant, which you probably are, how much do you coach?
yeah, that is very true. Versus the administrative and other
Right.
work. You have one fall season versus a year's worth of seasons. You train typically in the morning, maybe in the afternoon, versus training at nights. Typically, you have way better benefits coaching in college than coaching in youth soccer, which sometimes benefits, like that's not even a conversation that's even had. So that's that piece. And then you got pro soccer. And again, there's a very different skill set in pro soccer as well. So I guess what we're in a roundabout way of saying is that this is a space I think that could use some rethinking in how we structure it, if possible. I'm not even sure what the right way is or how to start that process. But I do think finding a way to recognize and reward really good coaches to move them forward in a pathway that is more transparent, that is more sustainable, is something that would make the sport better.
Yeah, and then I would also say um, greater widespread support for what these folks are doing.
Yeah.
Well, and I would say that about teachers too, right? Just
Yeah.
more widespread support um, on what these folks are doing. And that's not to say that everybody doesn't have a decision they can make whether they think that's the best environment for their kid or whatever. Um, but just more support uh, for what these folks do. Um,
Or just
would
maybe
help.
a little bit more understanding about what it takes and what goes into it. I think, I don't know if it was Carrie Bowley or somebody else who said, the easiest thing people to do, coaches do this to each other all the time, is watch somebody else's session and say, oh man, I wouldn't have done that. I wouldn't have done that. I would have changed this. This was bad. This was whatever. And if coaches do that to each other, parents are doing that on steroids whenever they see anything. And the first question actually really should be, what is the coach trying to accomplish? Because if we
Yeah.
go all the way back to, use my experience right now with the U8 team, and I have to figure out how to explain which side of the field is right and which side of the field is left. There's 1,000 problems on the field in any second, of which we can probably tackle two or three at once. And so it's easy to point out the 997 that are not being addressed right now, because somebody's got to prioritize which ones are being addressed. And I use that as a really, really easy,
Yeah. How
simple
did you,
example.
how are you going to solve it?
I just pointed, you know, just pointed. Um, but and then I draw. You can't even draw it on a piece of paper because it's
Yeah.
right on the field, and you get a point. But
You
that
got to
same
put
thing.
them, you got to put them out there and there's in the spots. And then you have to have a really fun name for each spot. And they will remember. Now they
Yeah.
might not remember right or left, Christian, and I can't promise you they will, but I will tell you if your right midfielder is called the stealth fighter or the X-wing,
I say, there is some truth to that.
you know?
But that's making it fun and making it different in a way that's really appropriate for those kids. But it's the same thing when you're dealing with an under 18, national championship level team. Somebody can criticize the session or
Yeah.
criticize what's going on because actually they're looking at it from a viewpoint that the coach doing the session has no concern about that issue right now. They're addressing something totally different. And so I think there's a little bit of that. There's a lot going on, a lot to balance. These people who are the backbone of our league, and they are the ones. A lot of these people are the ones that are talking internally at their clubs and saying, "Hey, we should do more of this or less of this." They're talking to the league directly about, "Hey, let's do this to change and make soccer better." Everybody's trying to do a good job. And it's a really rewarding, but a challenging profession. There are too many people that leave it, I think, for than we would want.
Yeah.
And that's a challenge for another day, maybe, but we felt it was worth the topic today.
Yeah. And I think the last thing I would say, and I've said this at our symposium, one of the great things that maybe we didn't think about when we started the ECNL and what it would become or whatever, is it's brought a lot of coaches together into a network. So, and I know, Christian, like I've called you a million times about something I'm working on with one of our teams or whatever, and gotten your your perspective on it. And I think that's one of the great things about a league like this is just bring some connectivity to the coaches, so we can, try to find best practices where we can, even if they're in our networks, which I think helps the level of coaching overall. There are certainly more former players, college and pro, coming into coaching, which makes coaching better. It's certainly gotten better since we started, I would say, right? Just the level of it. So it's good, but support your coaches. They're out there. They're out there doing their level best. I'm guessing.
Absolutely. All right, man.
Well,
Where are we going now?
We are going to thank another one of our sponsors, and it's Discount Tire. Want the same expert advice from the pros at a discount tire store while shopping online? Meet Treadwell, your personal tire guide. Whether you're driving to practice or game day, Treadwell gives you tire recommendations based on your vehicle, location, and driving habits. Get matched with the perfect tires so you can stay focused on the goals that matter most. Shop with Treadwell at discounttire.com. There it is. And now it is time for Bracken's Brain Buster. That's a complex topic that we just talked about that has a lot of variables. Don't you think, Christian?
I do. I don't know. Jacob and Dean are very silent right now. I don't know if they're falling asleep right now or if they're contemplative.
Absolutely not. That was a fantastic discussion.
Great discussion.
We need to disagree more, maybe, Christian. We need to argue more.
We could.
If they only saw us
Actually
behind the
getting pretty
scenes.
good at this.
Yeah. If they saw us behind the scenes, maybe they wouldn't say that. All right, you guys ready? We're going to do in the spirit of coaching, since we talked about coaching. And the question is, how much of coaching is science versus art?
Ooh.
So everybody's going to have their perspective. Not that everybody will have unique answers on this, but we are going to go first and foremost to the velvety voice of Dean Linke.
Dean talks to a lot of coaches in a lot of sports.
He does.
I do, but I also was a coach. So I coached my boys in everything, including high level AAU. And to me, I'll actually make it simplistic. To me, it's not science or art. It's about putting the right players on the court or on the soccer field that are going to get the job done. And that's kind of how I approached it. And I feel like we had success. So I'm not going to give you a big blustery answer, and it won't involve Leah. To me, it's just always about knowing, it's knowing your personnel, right? That's how I approach coaching and probably how I would do it today.
By the way, that's another vote for the player quality defines everything.
I will say to that, Dean, then you believe that coaching is more art, because understanding the right players and all that's an art. That's an art. Well, maybe it's a science. This guy's 7 foot and he can dunk.
No, I like the art answer. I like the art answer better. Thank you. I wish I would have said it that
way. Jacob.
I'm going to go the opposite. I think it's science because it's a lot of relationships, and relationships boils down to psychology. And so I think it's really understanding the psychology of the players, knowing what motivates them the most. Is it through positive reinforcement? Is it negative reinforcement? I think it's a lot of tactics as well. We talk about skill a lot here, but it's understanding where the players go the best and which tactics best fit the player. And so I think that's a big thing for the science. And then I think the third thing is just making sure that, you're putting the players in the right position with hydration, with training, with talk about athletic training, all that kind of stuff. So I think all of those are very science-based building blocks. So I say coaching is a science.
Okay. I need to contemplate on that. All right, Lavers.
I'm going to say very strongly art. I'm going to quote Fergus Connolly here, who said the NFL team with the most data and analytics had the worst record. And I do think that there are people that like to overcomplicate everything because it's a way of justifying their jobs. And I think ultimately, if we believe that the players are driving most of this, it's about interacting with them, seeing where they're at. It's a very fluid process. The relationships are fluid. Their performance levels are fluid. The constraints of their bodies and minds are fluid. And there is science involved in it. But I think if you lean too much on science, especially at the youth side, I think the younger you go, the more art that it needs to be. Because at the end of the day, the kids need to have fun. They need to come back. They need to feel good. And that's an art of managing that relationship in that environment.
Okay. I'm gonna go art for sure. And there's a scientific element to all these, to sports, no question about it. But totally agree with Christian. There's an art of managing people and understanding people and getting the best out of people and pushing the right buttons. I think, Christian talked about the younger kids and how you have to be artful of letting them know how to figure out what a left back is or a left midfielder. I would say equally as you go up the chain to the professional level, it's all about man management and understanding the right, the right people in the right places and the right, motivations. So I am going to go art on this one. And it's probably the hardest thing as a coach to learn. Takes the longest to kind of understand the art of it. So there it is. Coaching might be science, might be art. Depends on your opinion.
Well, whatever it is, it's hard.
Whatever it is, it's hard.
Yep.
It is hard. It's not to say that brain surgery isn't also hard, because it is.
A little more science.
A little more. It's true. It's true. Or calling a game on the on TV, Dean, also hard, right?
All right. Well, hey, thanks for the discussion, Doug, Dean, Jacob. Always good to see you.
Great to see you guys. Thank you.